Thank you very much. Maybe Paola, you want to go first, introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Paul, and thank you to everyone that has attended this meeting, and to our panelists again. My name is Paola Yanguas Parra, and I am a PhD student and research associate at the Coal-Exit Group of the Technical University of Berlin. And yeah, we'll share a little bit of our research with you later. So that's all I'm going to say about me. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Christian. I'm also a PhD student in the Coal-Exit Group affiliated with the Europa University of Flensburg and also Berlin. First of all, we'll share my screen, and we will give you a short overview and introduction to this topic on the perspectives for coal after the pandemic. This is mostly based on work that was published as the Death Valley of Coal Modeling COVID-19 Recovery Scenarios for Steam Coal Markets, work by Paola, Paul, and myself. And can put the link in the chat later. So first of all, a little overview, and don't worry too much about the details here, just some effects of the pandemic on the coal sector or related fields. In red, you see negative effects, in bluish, some positive effects, which are definitely in the minority. We've seen effects of COVID, of course, on one hand on mine closures due to, in order to prevent the spread of the pandemic, but then also, of course, the lockdown slowed down the economy and reduced demand for coal, which again then affected energy markets and increased competition by the different sources of electricity and energy. But of course, it's not only COVID that's affecting coal, but also there were many trends already observable prior to the pandemic, such as stricter environmental policies and increased competition from, for example, renewables. And all this together just created this environment for, not too good for coal, with global coal demand reduction of about 4% in the year 2020, very differently for different regions, such as in the EU and the US, up to minus 20% of demand, while China was the only major country with a slight increase of demand for coal in the year 2020. And in this small presentation, we'll give you some more details about pre-COVID trends, and then switch to the effects of COVID on the global energy markets and coal markets. And this will be followed by outlooks for coal and some concluding remarks. Summarizing the effects of pre-COVID trends, we've seen stricter environmental policies, increased competition, but that already affecting companies producing coal, etc., with a wave of financial institutions divesting from those companies. And here you can see that in the year 2014, we've probably already observed the peak of global coal use. Of course, you also again see that this is quite different for different regions. And in some countries of the global south, we still have, of course, further increase of demand due to new power plants being commissioned. However, if you look at commissioned and retired coal-fired power stations, you see here that in the year 2015, we've reached like the peak of net additions, and thereafter have seen more or less a continuous decline. And if you take out China of this equation, we've even seen a net decline of coal-fired power capacities. But of course, this again has shows regional differences, and yeah, can't be. This isn't the same for all countries. So a brief overview of pre-COVID trends. Now coming to COVID, this has come with a plethora of negative news for the coal market, reduced coal production in mines, reduced exports, etc. And taking this together, well, we've seen just like this unprecedented short-term shock for global coal demand, but also coal prices have dropped to like outstanding lows, and yeah, disruption of coal supply. The Economist even titled, well, that the time for coal might be coming to an end. So yeah, this to the direct COVID effects. Here's some more numbers. If you look at electricity production, you see here these orange dots in the year 2020, we have a total reduction in demand. And if you then look at which sources were affected most by this drop in demand, it's clearly coal, while renewables even increased their absolute amount of production. Yeah, as said before, the largest drop since World War II, and only China increased slightly its use of coal. When we look at production of coal, we also see a difference for different countries. China, again, wasn't affected really in the year 2020, but the United States, but also Indonesia, which is a major exporter of thermal coal, were hit quite hard. Global production declined by even more than demand, by -6.5 or by 6.5%. And of course, exporters of coal were hit especially hard, and yeah, prices reached historic lows. Coming to some longer term trends, if we look at what kind of capacities have been taking up the market shares, we see in green here that renewables in the last years have taken up a large share of the markets, while coal was losing the well, dark gray bars in most countries around the world. And especially countries of the OECD countries did lose coal generation. And well, the most prominent example, definitely the UK, with reduction of power generation from coal by 93%. And here, the year on year for the pandemic, we see that all around the world, yeah, coal generation did have to take hard losses. And with this, I would hand over for some more country insights to Paola. Thank you.
You're still muted, Paola.
Thank you. Can you see my screen now?
You can see your screen. It's not. Yes, perfect.
Great. So thank you for that, Chris. Yeah, so that is a big picture, the unprecedented shock in the coal markets, and we wanted to go a little bit superficially in what happened in concrete regions. So this graphic is showing the European Union and US, which have very different drivers behind this decline. But as you can see, even though in the European Union and the UK, this was more policy motivated, and in the US, this is more market-driven motivated, you can see very similar trends in the end of how fast the decline on coal generation has been in the last years. And you can see, if you compare, as Christian said, this was already coming before COVID, but as you can see in 2020 is quite stark. And some of the drivers behind that were basically in the European Union, or a very important driver was the European Union, the ETS carbon price, which was going up quite a bit in 2020 to levels that we haven't seen before, and reached even 40 euros per ton. And then, of course, the usual things that Chris was already mentioning, like even more financial institutions started committing to have some restrictions on coal projects. And this accelerated quite a bit in 2020. There were also quite some announcements about green recovery and not investing any recovery money on dark or brown industries such as coal power generation, and this basically created this accelerated trend for coal producers. Something that is important in the US, but everywhere in the world, is that precisely as Chris was saying, we saw a very stark decline of coal prices in the international market because of this reduced demand. And that put a lot of coal miners in particular, but also in general coal operators, into profitability problems, which then resulted in some bankruptcies of really big players, or just closures of mines of really big players. Yeah, here you can see it more clearly for other countries that are coal exporters mostly, and that are being affected precisely by these trends that I'm talking about in terms of the international coal markets. Countries such as Australia, Colombia, Indonesia, and South Africa, they were very affected. You can see, of course, it's a very volatile market as any commodity market, but as you can see, 2020 was super stark going down for all countries. So the exports of coal were going down for a large number of coal exporters. And not only were the amounts of coal being exported being reduced substantially, but also the prices. They reached an historic low of $34 per ton, which later in the year recovered quite a bit, in particular because of some trade restrictions by China to the Australian imports. But in any case, it was quite a strong movement, negative movement in terms of quantities and in terms of prices, which again put a lot of these producing regions and producing companies into a lot of pressure and financial distress. This was, of course, for coal dependent regions, in particular in countries like South Africa, Colombia, or Indonesia, where there are a lot of communities and so on being dependent on these rents from coal exports. This put a lot of pressure on employment, royalties, social investment, and so on and so forth. So this was something that sort of showing what sort of issues we could be seeing in this type of exporters and this type of regions if we start seeing a very fast decline in coal in the next years to come. Now, the biggest player in the world in terms of coal, the few countries that are still adding coal power plants to the system, and the largest consumers by far are all countries in Asia. And as Chris was also saying, this was the region in the world that behaved a little bit different, because yes, it started with a very strong decline in the first half of 2020, but then consumption, as economies started recovering and lockdowns started to ease, recovered quite fast. In particular, in in China, where at the end of the year we ended up with even an increase in coal consumption in the last quarter. But something that is really interesting as well is that India and China started adopting some policies to protect their national industries, their national coal industries, which we'll talk about that probably more with Sandeep, but basically meant for the international markets was a big reduction in the demand for international coal. So this is what is explaining these very strong movements that we saw in the seaborne market that we were just showing. And if you wonder why is this the case, why are they still promoting coal nationally if the economic drivers behind it are not there? Well, this is something that it's probably worth noticing, is that there's a state ownership for a lot of coal assets, especially coal mining, in both India and China, and the logics for state ownership in terms of financial indicators and so on and so forth are a bit different than what you would expect in countries like Colombia or the US, where they're a lot more driven by market forces. So indeed, there was still a strong decline in the first half of the year, but then we started seeing a not very green recovery, but a rather brown recovery in the second half of the year for most countries in Asia. Even though I have to say, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that were traditionally adding a lot of capacity came up with very interesting pledges, at least, or intentions to stop building coal-fired power plants during 2020. And where does it bring us? Where can we expect the global trends to go in the next year? This was the question we asked ourselves in this paper that I shared with you. And it's very hard to write a paper about a pandemic when the pandemic is not even coming to an end yet. So I apologize in advance if some of the things that we say here or in the paper are not necessarily the most up to date. But the point is that there is a lot of uncertainty. And this uncertainty is coming, of course, from the short-term shock, which we have seen already and explained in detail, but more importantly of these mid and long-term trends that will come with the recovery policies and the policies that will be adopted by countries in the future. So this huge uncertainty just brings us to a very large range of uncertainty, as you can see here in our different scenarios. So the most optimistic or pessimistic, depending on which is your perspective, is this a big shock in 2020 with a green recovery afterwards, and that will be the green line going down. As you can see, that will imply a very fast and very impressive decline in coal consumption globally. If this shock was big, and if all countries were doing green recovery after this, and coal were stopping to have positive subsidies and so on and so forth. However, you could also see that if this shock in 2020, 2021 is not too big, as we ended up seeing, it was not too big in the end because of the second half of the year recovery, and all countries were to, instead of really promote a green recovery, promote a brown recovery, where there's a lot of promotion of these brown industries, including coal, then you could see this orange line taking place. What is important about this, as you can see here, is a huge uncertainty, but the main takeaways is, first of all, this like dotted line that you see before, that was the steps scenario of the IEA in 2019. So the first takeaway is, no matter what happens, because of some tipping points in companies and in countries in 2020, we will probably never get to a scenario where we were in 2019 after 2020 for coal. But the second takeaway is, even in the most optimistic scenario that we were sort of modeling here, what you can see is that it's still not quite there in the dotted, like gray dotted line, which is a sustainable development scenario of the IEA, which is not even a 1.5 degree compatible scenario. So even in the most optimistic scenario, where there is a big shock due to the pandemic and countries implement green recovery policies, we still don't get to a 1.5 compatible scenario. So there is need for additional policies in the coal sector to really speed up this transition, if you want to name it like that. Oops, yeah. And speaking of green recovery versus brown recovery, this is some very preliminary figures that we have seen from other researchers which are analyzing at least public funding. Where is public funding going to in the recovery packages of G20 countries? So this is not comprehensive and not all the money is taken into account, just public money. But as you see, surprise, it's not very green, even though there were a lot of announcements and political statements about green recovery. When you look at the numbers, there is really still a lot of public money committed to fossil fuels, actually around 40% of the money still going to fossil fuels. With US, back then there was another administration, but still these commitments stay, I guess. With US being the worst performer in absolute terms, and the usual suspects, Turkey, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and new suspects like Argentina being the worst performers in relative terms, with almost all the money going to brown recovery and fossil fuels. And on the other hand, countries like India being the best performer in absolute terms, and Japan and China being also the best performers, but in relative terms, with over 70% of their public funds on recovery going to green industry. So yeah, that is a takeaway. And very quickly, we just wanted to show you, we used simulation model that is simulating international coal markets for producers, and we saw, okay, what would happen with exports and with exporters under these different scenarios. And without going into much detail, there's this huge span of scenarios, but what you can see very, very clearly here is that in particular, especially because there are some policies in terms of import bans that are not completely market driven, but they're politically motivated, such as what we saw in China and India. You see that a few exporters, including South Africa, Colombia, also USA, will be very, very strongly hit by these changes. And this will be basically what we call a dramatic change in the composition of international trade, coal trade, and that's going to create basically a lot of issues. And if you take into account that not even the most optimistic scenario that we consider is a 1.5 compatible scenario, what you would expect under a 1.5 compatible scenario, it's a very, very disruptive scenario, at least for coal exporters. And because of this, you will need concentrated policies, not only to speed up this transition to get more into 1.5 pathway, but also to deal with the very extreme consequences in coal producing regions that this big and fast disruption might have. So yeah, that was all from our side. Just again, very quickly, our conclusions. The pre-COVID negative trends in coal markets were accelerated by the pandemic. This 2020 shock for global energy demand, commodity prices, and so on and so forth, hit very strongly the coal sector in a structural way in some cases, with the reaching of tipping points for some actors. But what will happen in the long term for the outlook will be more depending on the policies and recovery policies and structural change policies that are implemented in the coming years by big players, in particular China and India. But they will not be sufficient, even in the most optimistic scenario that we consider, they will not be sufficient to reach a 1.5 degree target. So we will need concentrated efforts and policies in the coal sector after the pandemic to accelerate this transition, but also to make it a more just transition, in particular for coal exporting countries and the coal dependent exporting regions within those countries. Yeah. So basically, there is a need for a plan and manage coal phase out and a just transition plan for all these countries that will be affected by this huge transformation in the coal sector. Thank you so much. That was it.
Thank you very much to Paola as well as Chris for this great presentation. And therefore, basically, now we have possibilities for direct questions from the audience. You can simply type in your questions into the chat. Don't be surprised that you can't see them then directly, because they only pop up on our screen, so to speak, and then we will read them out. So basically, the first question is a bit more methodological question to you. What kind of model was it that you used for this analysis? So I guess this is maybe a bit more to Chris than to Paola, but of course, then Paola is maybe with respect to these, how to the just transition aspects, policy rating, maybe some aspects, but Chris.
Yeah, thanks for this question. So this is a sectoral model for the global thermal coal market, representing coal production, coal exporters, and then consumption on the other hand, which is of course restricted by transport capacities, etc. The model decides where to invest, where to produce, etc. Demand is given to the model as exogenous demand scenarios. So demand is not created like in an integrated assessment model or something like that by the model itself, but rather given exogenously. And therefore we've designed those different scenarios for COVID shock and further development, and then did assess with the model what effects this has on the coal producers. Hope this answers the question more or less. Some more information, of course, in the paper, but yeah, if you want more information, just we can also discuss bilaterally.
Yeah, and maybe just shortly on the demand, because as Chris said, this is we built it, and to do this, again, it's a huge range. We have a combination of methods. One of them was like an expert survey, experts of different countries, sort of giving us insight on the more short-term shocks, and then on a big media coverage and official documents coverage and analysis of the announcements on green recovery policies. And based on this, we created a few scenarios. As Chris said, there are more details in the paper, and we're happy to talk to you bilaterally if you have questions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. An additional question would be, as you mentioned, that it is, of course, difficult to do this kind of research while the pandemic is still ongoing, and especially if you do academic research, which has to go through numerous review processes, academia is slow, so to speak. So as the pandemic has continued, but the paper is already published, and we have seen a second wave and a third wave, and I don't know, maybe there's soon to be a fourth wave of the pandemic. Do you think that the assumptions within the paper still hold, or have you more overestimated or underestimated the pandemic's effect on the coal sector? I'm not speaking about the health issues and all these things, but as the paper is focusing on the effects on the coal sector, have these continued to be as is expected, or would you say that so to speak, the second half of the pandemic was different from the first half, and therefore some estimations were too low or too high?
Yeah, maybe. So at the time we wrote this paper, there was a projection by the International Energy Agency on this short-term shock for 2020, which was around -8% globally for electricity consumption from coal. In the end, as you saw in the beginning of our presentation, China got a grip quite quickly on the pandemic somehow, and they also started recovering quite fast. So this like last quarter of the year was definitely not accounted for in this original projection that we were using for our paper. So the short-term shock was in the end -4%, so half of what we had expected originally to be. However, we had also sort of accounted for some uncertainty. So in the end, the bigger term, you see a very big range. And this very big range, what we're seeing now is within that range. Unfortunately, I would say on the upper end of the half of that range. So we're looking into not a very big reduction, or rather flattening, instead of a very speedy reduction. But yeah, this is definitely challenging. We will keep observing. However, I am not exaggerating when I say, I think, at least when it comes to tipping points for coal producers and for a lot of coal utilities, this was really really observed, and I don't think there's an easy way of coming back on that unless you subsidize massively in the recovery efforts a lot of these private firms on the coal business, but we can talk about that more later. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe one addition. So we've seen, especially in countries of Southeast Asia, that their pipelines of new coal-fired power stations has shrunk a lot, and so outlook for coal demand in the future is just reduced by those. What we didn't think that China would pick up demand so quickly again. So this kind of blurs the picture because Chinese demand is just the largest part. But yeah, regional specifics are quite diverging.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I will continue from there to the next part of our talk. If people still have additional questions, you can still pose them then into the question box, and then we will respond to them at a later stage. So don't be stopped, basically, if you have any further questions. And of course, you can always contact speakers also afterwards via email, as you will find them online somewhere. Going up to the next speaker, Dr. Nicole Glaneman. I hope that the audio now works. We had some technical problems beforehand, just to explain the situation to people. So whether you can just check whether we can hear you. We will then later on put up the slides by Christian. But just Ms. Glaneman, can you hear us? And basically, we will start the panelists with Chinfiem Helen Ma, then followed by Sandeep Pai, and then afterwards Rebecca Pop. So this is basically the order that we will take. Basically going first into his perspective more on China's and international Chinese cooperation, so to speak, then to India, and then going back to Europe, so to speak. So this is our geographical scope that we will be covering. And therefore, I'm very glad that all three of you could make it, basically, to join us with your different expertise. And therefore, we would first start, as I mentioned, with Chen-Yue Helen Ma, and she is basically a research and project lead at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. And she has originally been educated at the Beijing University as well as at the Johns Hopkins University. So I think even your education shows your international experience in these fields, which are very important. And you're specialized in international economics as well as development finance. And I think these financial streams are things that are often overlooked by many people, but they, to be honest, they decide a lot of things in the world. And therefore, especially understanding a bit better the Chinese development finance and cooperation, as well as with aspects of green finance, I think are of utter importance. And therefore, we're very thankful that you're here to share your insights. So basically, the virtual floor is yours.
Yeah, many thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me here. So as introduced, I am from the Global Development Policy Center at the Boston University. And we are a center that focuses on policy research that is dedicated to sustainable development and socially inclusive development. And my project, the Global China Initiative, focuses more on China's overseas development finance and how it impacts and how the policies could be diverted towards a more environmentally sustainable and socially inclusive direction. Yeah, so I am going to talk a little about China and the global energy transition in the era of COVID-19. But as introduced, my expertise is more on the overseas activities. So I will touch on the domestic perspective, which is also in my radar. But I think I will just use this as maybe a prompt for more discussions. So these are already shown by Christian and Paula. Basically, we already know that China is the only G20 country that has seen an increase in cogeneration in 2020. And the increase has mostly been from the latter quarters after the rebound from the COVID-19, and a little more into the fuel mix within China. So this is mainly driven by the demand rebound, and maybe also partly because of the policy response after the September announcement of the carbon neutrality and net zero at the UN. So a lot of the capacities that had been kept during the COVID-19 era was rushed to operations. But there has also been a big push for renewable energy. So the proportion of coal-fired power capacity dropped to below 50% for the first time by the end of 2020. And then in the first quarter of 2021, it further decreased to 48.8%. So there has been this, so the actions has been happening, but is the policy also supporting these actions? So domestically, I think this is going to be what I will spend the most time on. And this is basically just a structure for the elements that are needed for carbon transition. And I guess I can talk about the policies that has been put forward, which is changing very fast. So I will just talk about what I have been catching up on to the newest progress. So in short, there has been a lot of effort going on, but still it is obviously going to be very challenging, basically because of the strong demand for energy and the need for structural transition. So most basically, we will need to have renewable energy drive to meet the demand, freeze the new capacities for coal, retire the old ones, and control the carbon intensity of the economy. So in terms of policies, these are laid out in the 14th National 5-Year Plan that was put out in March. And then the specific action plans for the local governments have also been put out during these recent months. And in terms of the enterprises, a lot of the SOEs who have been the major supporters of coal power generation and the coal industry have also put out carbon transition plans gradually to different extents. So there has been actions on these different levels on the policy side. And then more systematically or on different micro and macro levels in terms of emissions control, the policies previously had been mostly on the energy sector. And this year, more policies have been put out for the industrial sector. And in terms of the enterprises, I think many of the major state-owned enterprises have been signing MOUs with the Ministry of Environment and Ecology on strategically controlling the emissions. And also more on the more macro level, in terms of finance and carbon pricing, in the recent months, China has updated the green finance taxonomy, basically excluding the fossil fuels from green finance. And in terms of greening the financial system, the central bank has put out an evaluation system for the banking sector, basically including the climate aspect into the banking evaluations of all the banks within China. And then in terms of carbon pricing, the national carbon market has been started, even though with the current status of the electricity market in China, which is beginning to reform and beginning to introduce more trading, this is still in early stages. So the carbon market is probably playing more of a role of a carbon tax, but maybe not sufficiently without enough electricity market reform. And that is also linked to grid adaptation, which will be needed as we introduce more renewable energy. So this is, I would say, one of the difficult sections for the carbon transitions in China. And then also the just transition. Also, not much formal policy has already come up, but there is a lot of dialogues and discussions in China on this topic. So I would say a structural transition of the economy to reduce the carbon intensity, and then electricity market reform, and just transition would be some of the key issues for the domestic transition. And then with these going on, it is important that these efforts are not transferring the burden to overseas activities. And then, has there been actions in terms of decarbonization with China's overseas energy financing? So this chart shows yes. So there has been a general decline in China's overseas energy financing since 2017, which is mainly driven by fossil fuels. However, because the general amount is declining, there is still a significant portion that is going to the coal sector. And policies have not been in place, like the multilateral development banks and many of the OECD banks that have moved away from coal. And recently actions have also been going on with Korea, Japan. So this is probably one of the fields that needs the most urgent actions. And then what has been the mechanism and drivers of the decline? Is this trend going to sustain? So we have been looking at it from the push and pull perspective. Basically, the most fundamental driver is the demand, has been the demand from the recipient countries in the past, which mostly have been dependent on coal for a long time or are hoping to diversify their energy portfolio. So they have been looking to China, which is probably one of the only international funders that are still left for coal. So as more and more countries actually move away from coal in their domestic policies, so there has been and is going to be a smaller demand from the international perspective. And domestically, I would say that is where the most actions would have to come from, and in both ways, with China also promoting the greening the Belt and Road Initiative and all those kinds of things. I would say many of the domestic policies would also have to synchronize with the overseas investment and finance perspectives. Yeah, so time is limited. I will just stop there, but I would just hopefully this would open up some more discussions. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for these great insights. Basically, we would directly jump to the second talk and then the third talk, and then afterwards have basically a joint round of questions and allowing for discussions among you and with the audience, etc. So therefore, without further ado, I would basically hand over to Sandeep Pai. Sandeep is a senior research lead on energy security and climate change program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he has recently finished his PhD, also looking at the just transition aspects of many countries, including also, of course, India, which he's a particular expert of, and he's a co-author of the book Total Transition: The Human Side of the Renewable Energy Revolution. So therefore also we are talking a lot about coal, but of course the other side of the coin is renewables. So therefore something we shouldn't forget. So therefore, Sandeep, great to have you here, and basically the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pavio, Paula, and everybody else. You know, it's really nice to always connect with you guys and work on these topics. So I don't have a presentation. I'll spare everyone with one more presentation. And so what I would do is I would basically start by giving you a flavor of where coal is at in India. And then I will talk about a little bit about renewables, and then finally I'll talk about my favorite topic, which is just transitions. And all because everybody else has talked about, I was planning to talk about it more globally, but I think if everybody has talked about it very globally, so I will focus much more on India. I think the COVID-19 story that happened in India was like, there were lots of news stories, there was lots of analysis that people said that, okay, you know, coal is dead. Like PLFs were down and not dead, but like coal is going to decline rapidly. But within 1 year, we have seen that coal is back almost to its previous levels as where it was. I think the PLFs have risen by 20% and so on. And at the same time, you know, more capacity is being built. 60, the numbers vary, but I think roughly about 60 gigawatts is under pipeline. You know, some would say it's 50, some would say it's 60, but I think it's officially it's 60. Not all will get built, not because India doesn't want to build, but because, you know, anything India declares, you can cut it by half. And that story goes for both coal and renewables, or not half, but, you know, okay, I don't want to be that rude to the policymakers, but you can cut to a few 20-30%. So, you know, this is sort of, I would say, not the ultimate, but the penultimate sort of like last phase of coal expansion in India in the power sector. Maybe there will be one more round of maybe, you know, a few gigawatts of additional investment going forward in the future. And that's a maybe. And then that would be, I think, the story of the power sector. But the industrial sector would be a very different story, where I think coal will still continue to rise. Even IEA's different scenarios predict that, you know, in the coal growth of coal use will really comes from the industrial steel, cement, and other sectors. So that's where the coal story is. I think the story of coal is not so much in India about phasing out coal, but rather how do we peak coal fast? Like the story is not like, you know, can we phase out by 2040, but the story is like, can we peak like in the next 2 years or 5 years or whatever, like, you know, and that would be really the best way to approach this topic, which will have wider acceptance within the country. So that is the coal story. Now, the renewable story, India's renewable story is obviously like fantastic. You know, it started around 2010, and, you know, we are already 90 gigawatts in 10 years with a really ambitious target of 175 gigawatts by next year. Now, that target was looking really good, but COVID has really impacted that target. I mean, there were issues in the renewable story pre-COVID, and those issues really pushed renewables. There are land issues, there is issue with the distribution companies not paying money to the renewable generators, lots of policy flip-flops. It's not just about renewables, those kinds of policy flip-flops happen everywhere. And the result of all that is that it is really like likely that, you know, the target of 175 gigawatt by 2022 will be missed by at least 50 gigawatts. And so that, I mean, you know, you can hold me to it, but, you know, it could be 40, it could be 30, but and so that means that the renewable story also needs to pick up if we want to really peak coal. So just wanted to give that perspective on that. Now, this is very short term. You know, we're talking about peaking coal as well as renewables, and how to deal with some of the really big challenges that renewables are facing in the country. But in the long run, the story of coal, if we really need to peak and then phase out, you know, in a sense, what Germany and others are talking about, I think the big question will come down to domestic politics. And that will come down to how we handle the issue of just transition, right? Because there are 7 states, rather 5 states and plus 2 additional states where coal, dominates sort of the fiscal, public finance, jobs. As certain regions within those states are really heavily coal dependent. In one of my studies, I estimate that about 30% of Indian districts, which is the the county equivalent, which is a subnational jurisdiction within a state, has some kind of coal dependency, either coal jobs or coal revenues, or so as Paula was saying before, that India has sort of these state-owned enterprises, right? And so it's a welfare model. I mean, it's changing now. It's becoming more and more sort of like private, even though they're state-owned, more profit-driven, but they still have a huge welfare mandate. They have to build roads. They have to, these are coal mining and power companies, but they still have to continue to invest in what is called corporate social responsibility. And they do invest like almost, we estimate about $200 million US dollars every year. There's lots of revenue collection. So all this to say that the coal landscape and the coal ecosystem is quite big in certain pockets. And once we start to talk about really not really phase out, some of these questions will really emerge. And so this is a really good phase to really understand the scale of dependency and how one can tackle some of those issues. But yeah, so one of the things would be beyond the techno-economic issues, where how you deal with discoms, the grid, renewable integration, some of these domestic political issues that arise. If we don't address the question of just transition, will really shape whether India really decides to phase out coal once it's peak. So that conversation has not started and will not start in the next few years. But once it starts, this will really kick in as how do you shape some of these questions about just transition. I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sandeep, for this great introduction to this complex case of India, basically, which has already been complex before COVID. But of course, that's what we learned of COVID, that whatever existed before COVID became even more complex through it. And therefore, handing over basically to Rebecca Popp. And Rebecca is a policy advisor at the think tank Third Generation Environmentalism, E3G, based in Berlin. And she's a trained political scientist. And she specializes on just transition aspects as well, climate neutrality topics in the EU as well as globally. And therefore, we are very glad that she can give us her perspectives also on the global trends, but she's, as I mentioned, also expert on what's happening in Europe, and not only in Germany, but also especially Central and Eastern European countries, where it is sometimes even more complicated. So therefore, glad to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pao Yu. And as you said, I mean, I usually focus more on coal phase out in the EU, but today I thought I'd zoom out a bit and talk about some of the recent political developments that have an impact on global coal phase out, because a lot of very exciting things have been happening recently. But before I start to dive into it, I wanted to show this graphic because it illustrates really well how the global coal phase-out pathway needs to develop. I mean, I think it's no surprise to all of you who are attending this event that we will need a very fast phase-out of coal globally to reach 1.5 or remain below 1.5 degree and reach net zero emissions by 2050. But recently, the International Environment Agency, Energy Agency, has put out a possible pathway to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And this is actually a fairly big deal, because the IEA is usually a more conservative, fossil fuel friendly actor. But what they clearly show is that it will require a clean power sector by 2040 to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And this means that the EU and OECD countries will have to phase out coal by 2030. and reach a clean power sector by 2035. And the rest, other countries outside of the OECD, will need to reach a clean power sector by 2040. And what this report also shows is that basically all the technologies exist to make this a reality. The policies are proven, but the question is really the political will. So how does the politics look globally? What you can really say is that coal phase out has become a political priority in the last year or two. So it has really gone all the way to the top. We have, for example, the Secretary General of the UN who's calling for global coal phase out and is asking richer countries to phase out by 2030 and others by 2040. We have the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, at the end of this year, and the UK, which is holding the presidency, has clearly made coal phase out, or has put coal phase out at the heart of this conference. And then we had a reference to this in the previous presentation by the Economy Ministry already a couple of days ago. In mid-June, the G7 countries, the leaders of the G7 countries met, and they also made clear that coal phase out is crucial, that it needs to be accelerated. And this was actually the first time that they provided such strong messaging on coal, so a very clear international signal. And of course, I mean, if the G7 achieves progress on coal phase out, this is also a very important enabler for coal phase out globally. And we've been talking about the economics of coal a couple of times already. So I really want to briefly highlight that actually increasingly coal is becoming very uneconomic. And there's this really interesting analysis by the Rocky Mountain Institute and others of coal plants globally. And they show that now it's already cheaper to build new renewables and storage than to build new coal plants nearly everywhere in the world. And what the graphic on the right shows that in 2025, it will also be cheaper to build new renewables and storage than to operate most of the coal plants worldwide. So more than, so roughly 80% of coal plants will be uncompetitive by then if you compare them to renewables. And this really shows, I think, that in some cases, I mean, market dynamics are often a bit quicker than government policy, and governments really have to catch up. And maybe to provide a segue to the discussion that is now following, I wanted to highlight a few risks or challenges that we see that can make, that put a risk to global coal phase out. And of course, this has also been mentioned in the previous presentations. One question is, or one problem is the global coal plant pipeline. So there are countries in Southeast Asia, in Africa, as well as China, obviously, that are planning to build new coal plants. And this obviously will be a critical factor. Paola also talked about the recovery. So to stimulate the economies after COVID, especially the G20 have put in place large recovery packages. And the question really is, will they be used to build back better, or do they subsidize coal power production? And Paola has already highlighted that some of the first indications that we have already look like a substantial amount of money will be pumped into fossil fuels. And then we already talked a couple of times about just transition. So to ensure that there's actually social buy-in for coal phase out, it's crucial how the transition is being managed and whether just transition is actually an enabler for accelerating coal phase out. And then lastly, I think this is a really important point, is that, I mean, many countries, we had this in the discussion on Germany, that many countries actually don't have the financial resources available to finance expensive compensation or retirement schemes. So the question is really whether the international community will mobilize enough support for early coal retirements. And I'm going to stop here so that we can dive into the discussion. And I'm also happy to provide more insights into the European context afterwards.
Perfect, Rebecca. Thank you very much. So once again, people that have questions can simply post them in the question and answer box, and I will then simply always read them out so that the speakers then know when to respond to which question. So basically, we will take a first round of questions. We would start first with a question to Shinjo Ma and then to Sandeep Pai. So the first one to Shinjo Ma is coming from Jan Steckel. His question is, would you expect that Chinese overseas investments in the future will be driven increasingly by reasons that come from within China? For example, to stabilize turbine industry, etc. So is this something that from your perspective will play a big role?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think I can expand a little more on how we have been thinking about the mechanisms of China's overseas coal financing and trade. So it's basically the link between the pull drivers from overseas and the push drivers from China's maybe the industrial sector and the policy policy pushes for internationalization is the development of the sector. So basically, these companies would go look for opportunities overseas and bid for projects for construction or parts exports. So in the end of the day, these companies don't have much of a say on what they are going to export or what they're going to build. Are they going to build a coal power plant or a gas turbine power plants or whatever? So basically they are looking for whatever they can get contracts for. And it happens that their strength is on the fossil fuel sector and maybe also hydro, all these big projects that China has been developing domestically and accumulating experiences. So I would say the fundamental driver would always be the demand for from the recipient countries. Otherwise, they don't have a big that policy influence of telling them what to build. So I would say it will still be the balance that always drives towards the equivalence, and there is probably going to be have to be both changes from the recipient countries and Chinese regulations for overseas finance and investment to make China's shift from coal in their overseas activities happen.
Perfect, thank you very much. Then we hand over to Sandeep. It's another question also by Jan. First of all, he says, thanks for the great input and good to basically see you at least virtually. And he fully agrees that it comes down to the politics and regional aspects. And in his understanding, the just transition challenges for India also relate to many people being informally employed in the sector. And he would be interested in your thoughts how to design then just transition policies, including those people in particular, and particularly in regions where alternative employment opportunities are arguably scarce. So we also had another talk this morning already, focusing a bit on some Indian aspects, and there we heard that basically the potential for renewable energy is not necessary in coal regions. So therefore, what I think know that you also wrote a paper on that. So yeah, handing over to you.
Yeah, well, same here, and really nice. Thank you for the question. I think this is one of those really complex questions which are really difficult to answer, but I will try to give a flavor of what it could look like. So I think one of the key challenges, as Jan said, is the informal coal sector employment. So just for the context for others who may not be familiar with, like in many and now I'm doing some work in South Africa, and I also see a similar sort of like industry there. And so you have the formal industry, you have the the big companies, the Coal Indias of the world, and the NTPCs, and they are producing coal and then burning it for electricity. And then you have these villagers who are basically largely in coal mining areas, who basically scavenge coal, extract coal, and there are layers of these people, right? Some are doing it at very individual level, some are doing it at groups, and so on. And so they gather this coal and then they use it domestically sometimes. They also sell it in the open market. And so somebody had done sort of an estimate that they collectively produce about 20-25 million ton. And these are very small scale operations. So almost artisanal kind of mining. They rely on abandoned mines and so on. And part of the challenge is that they have not been included in any kind of just transition discourse. And their numbers are much, much higher. Although I can't provide you a number, but if you just travel to those regions, you know that their numbers are much higher than any formal employment could even imagine. So the question is, how do we include them in the just transition process? And so one of the answers that I would give is diversification of those very regions. So I mean, it's and the story that Pao you mentioned is that renewables are happening in a very different part of the country, not where coal will decline. And so already coal is a dominant industry, and these people have no agency. They're not organized. The formal workers are organized. They have very good unions representing them. And so if India comes up with a Just Transition Commission, the formal workers will be very well heard. But if India comes out with a Just Transition Commission, it's not clear who will represent these large informal workforce. And so my two answers to that question, and I think it requires, that's where, it requires years of research to come up with the answer. But the two speculative answers would be, one is that they be included in any modeling or energy planning so that we think about what their future will be. And second, we also think about how these regions, as a whole region, the states like Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh, can diversify and create, employment sectors that create large amounts of employment. And so some of the ideas that people throw, which I have to say are quite absurd, are like agriculture, tourism, and so on. I mean, those sectors, agriculture is already struggling in India. So I don't know what the new sector would be, but I think we have to come up with realistic sectors that can absorb some of these really low skilled or no skilled people. I don't know if I answered that question, but that's sort of how I'm thinking about this. But like I said, my last word is it really requires deeper research to understand the layers of these informal workforce and how do you transition, reskill them, and so on.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Then I would hand over to Rebecca for another question. Basically, we've heard a lot about how COVID makes things more complicated, but at the same time, in your talk, you have basically highlighted some good news of the story, a lot of good news, especially a bit more maybe from the global north, of new announcements to phase out fossil fuels. So from your experience and impression, do you think these exclamations to be basically sincere and that countries really follow suit on these things? We've also heard the perspective of the German ministry basically and how far this is then in line. So what is your experience with these announcements, whether it's from G7, whether it's from the European Commission? Is this something that is really good news, or is this just a nice package where we don't really expect this to have any change on site?
Yeah, thanks. And it's obviously right that, many of these examples come from the global north. But I think what needs to be recognized, first of all, is that we saw this positive progress despite the COVID pandemic. So we saw that climate action, that coal phase out remained a priority. And I think that is really important to recognize. And then, of course, you're right, as you say, those are important international benchmarks. For example, the G7 commitment to an overwhelmingly decarbonized power sector in the 2030s, but it's now obviously up to countries or the European Union to actually deliver on these announcements domestically. But what we do see on the ground is fairly positive, I think. It just needs a bit more clarity. So for example, the US plans for a clean power sector by 2035. Many studies suggest that this will imply a coal phase out by 2030. So this is something that the new government also needs to provide clarity on. Or similar in the EU, the EU is very well positioned to phase out coal by 2030. And now in the summer, we will see that the Commission will put forward a lot of proposals on climate, energy, transport, to implement its new climate target for 2030. And this will, for example, also include strengthening its emission trading system. So we will see a higher carbon price, which will also push coal out of the market. And I think the EU needs to communicate this a bit more clearly as well, and showcase what it has been doing to phase out coal, and also combine this with this support effort. And yeah, given these positive developments, I think there's really a case also to be made for the US, the UK, the EU, to use this domestic progress to engage more strongly international, and also provide the support to some countries like South Africa, for example, or India, and create these support mechanisms to actually allow for early retirements of coal plants. And the next month will be really crucial, because I mean, there is a lot of people expect this from COP26 to show that there's really a commitment to phase out coal globally.
Perfect, thank you very much. And I would hand over to Chinyuma for two additional questions. There's one by Naja Memon. Keeping in mind China's ambiguous OBOR project, how do you see Chinese investments in the coal-fired power plants as a justifiable move for achieving energy transitions? And maybe also, could you explain then what the OBOR project is, because I'm not sure that everyone knows. And then there's a second question by Christian Hauenstein, maybe, which you would like to maybe pose directly so she can answer two of them.
Yeah, thanks. One follow-up question to also the financing issues. Talking to coal traders, etc., we heard that Chinese investments in coal mines overseas might be also to stabilize global coal markets, to then like have more or less stable prices for coal imports. Do you think this is an argument for coal mine investments, Chinese investments in coal mines, for example, in Colombia, or is it rather outdated already because China is focusing on domestic supply or even increasing domestic supply? Thanks.
Yeah, these are great questions. So I will start with the first one on the OBOR, which we used to call it One Belt, One Road, but now we call it the Belt and Road Initiative. But yeah, what's in the name? So in short, it is not a justifiable option for energy transition from the climate perspective, period. And so maybe perhaps in terms of other air pollution perspectives, research has shown that the coal-fired power plants supported by China has been cleaner comparatively with coal-fired power plants financed by other sources. So basically, because they are generally bigger, they use the higher standards that domestically China has been using. And generally, the bigger projects allowed for the supercritical, ultra supercritical technologies that allow for lower emissions. So in that perspective, it is comparatively not the worst, but still from a climate perspective, it is not justifiable. Yeah, so as I said, the mechanism is just there. So we will need actions from both domestic and the recipient countries. And in terms of coal mines, I would have to apologize because I haven't really focused on coal mines in my data research. But from my observations in the recent financing activities, there has not been a lot of new mining especially in coal overseas. Basically, the domestic demand is shrinking as well, and probably they would when they invest overseas, they would prefer maybe the higher quality and more efficient coal sources. But I would still say with the transition in perspective, that is not going to make sense economically. Yeah, so I guess that's my short answers to the questions. And I just want to also echo Sandeep's observations on India's just transition is really the same story for China, where the coal needs to be phased out is also not where the renewable energy is booming. So the imbalance is the same for China as well. And China has been also diversifying the portfolios of the energy companies as well, in attempts to, because they are all basically national companies and own different assets all over the country. So from a corporate perspective, I guess that's one of their efforts. But still, in terms of a lot of the informal employees and as a welfare system, there is a big challenge there. Yeah, so I guess I can also add one word for the international cooperation. I guess this is something that we haven't touched on, the geopolitics that has been in the G7 communiques for phasing out coal, which has mostly been focusing on public finance, where a lot of efforts and progress has already been reached. I mean, outside of China. So China is the biggest public financier for international coal finance. So that is correct. And that is where China needs the most urgent actions. But the public finance in general is still a small percentage of all the newly added coal in the world. So perhaps the most impactful actions will have to come from the private sector. And then the private sector themselves have done a lot of bottom-up commitments of net zero targets and plans. But still, in terms of maybe the whole financing sector, in terms of disclosure, there is still a lot that the public sector can do to regulate the private sector. So yeah, I do see a lot of space, and I think at least also from not only from the climate perspective, but also from the geopolitical perspective, to really commit to phasing out coal. But still, there is also a lot of space that needs to focus on the technical or technocratical aspects of it, rather than geopolitical sizing things, which makes things more complicated.
Perfect. Very interesting. I would hand over to Sandeep before afterwards turning for a last question to Rebecca due to the effect of time. So therefore, but first of all, Sandeep.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo this geopolitical point. And I want to pick up this recent G7 announcement of $2 billion, right? While I welcome the commitment, I think it's great, it's in the right direction, but the amount of money won't pay for one state in India's coal phase out. Like, to give you a context, like Coal India, according to my calculation, sort of contributes in salaries, taxes, CSR and various other ways, about $15 billion per year, right, to different regions. So this is such a small amount that within the country, the conversations that I've heard is like, this is kind of a joke, right? So just wanted to say that it's a bad move in the sense that it's already dividing people who wanted to unite on this topic. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that, but that's sort of where we have to think more carefully about how we phrase all these things.
Mm-hmm. I would definitely agree on that, and also that words are very important. And handing over to Rebecca for a last question, which is also linked basically to the topic of today's session, which was basically coal after the pandemic. And so therefore, after the pandemic, we always are thinking about a recovery, and then people always say we want a green recovery, we want a good recovery, but how do we do this? So therefore, Rebecca, from your end, like how could this recovery be used to accelerate climate action and just transition, whether this is in Europe or globally, whatever you want to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question, and maybe just to like remind us again of this graphic I showed, how quickly actually we need to achieve progress on phasing out coal and having a clean electricity sector. And I think with the recovery, this is really an opportunity, because there's a lot of money available, at least in the countries of the global north, to invest in stimulating the economy. And for example, this IEA report that I've shown has clearly shown that there is no need for any new investments into new fossil fuel supplies. So it's really an opportunity to finance clean energy. And I think what will be important is, for one, that regions like the EU or country groups like the G7 lead by example and show how you actually go about a green recovery, set ambitious standards for their domestic recoveries, and then also provide international support, because this is what has been missing from the G7 summit, and where there's a lot of uncertainty if we look ahead to COP26, is whether there will actually be enough climate finance, for example, mobilized to also allow countries in the global south to have a green recovery and invest in the recovery. And maybe just one aspect, because we haven't touched on it so much, but I think the key question is also, I mean, where to transition to after coal. So it really there needs to be a concerted push for clean energy, for renewable energy. So yeah, maybe to answer this very broad question.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Then handing over to Paola.
Yeah, just very quickly, I wanted to pick up on your question about how can we use these efforts and recovery efforts to sort of speed up the transition. And I think what you said, Rebecca, it's extremely important, because until we ensure that there is actually wealth transfer, right, for climate action, but really happening, and the self-imposed commitments and amounts are really transferred, it's going to be a little bit hard. So that is definitely a point, and I wanted to stress, I guess, an opportunity but a challenge that the pandemic brought in this regard. So the opportunity, I really think, in terms of macroeconomic management of in general spending, public spending, the pandemic showed a big change, right? Countries were very, very shy, developed, and everyone was very shy on public spending and on sort of having this state driving in one or the other direction, the economy and so on and so forth. This changed extremely in the pandemic, whereas almost every country was really strongly intervening, and just basically it's like a big macroprudential and so on rules were really shaped this year, and I think that is an opportunity, because the public sector is more willing now to steer a little bit public spending into certain sectors, which is a great opportunity. However, and this is the challenge, I think, there's no free lunch in a way, and there is no an infinite amount of public money that can be spent into this thing. So definitely, like, you need to leverage, you need to steer, but you need to leverage a much larger amount of private investment and money going into the right direction, and that is a question how to do that. And I think in particular, the room for spending and for using this public money to steering, it's much more reduced in developing countries, because as Sandeep and others were saying, a lot of the role of the fossil fuel companies, not only coal, but in general oil and so on, depending on the country, they're really just like welfare providers. And a lot of these just transition questions, or transition questions in general, they're about a provision of basic development questions in the most basic sense. And that requires quite a lot of public spending, right? Because it's building roads and public infrastructure that's not necessarily leveraging a lot of private sector in some cases, but at the same time, this is what I wanted to focus on. There is an increasing amount of public debt. Thanks to the pandemic, this was accelerated, but it's just in general a trend that developing countries have like a huge and growing external debt. So I just wanted to finalize a bit controversial statement on, but maybe climate finance and wealth transfer from developed countries to developing countries to accelerate the transformation could start looking into debt restructuring and smart ways to really address these issues of public financing and development in developing countries. And that's all from my side. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Paola, for this additional addition, which is, I think, definitely of importance. So we are basically reaching an end, and I'm also taking basically the liberty of being the chair of the session for a last advertisement round, as we also have another research project that I would like to advertise, which I hope that you can see now. Trajects is also was visible already on the upper right screen of Paola's image continuously. And what you can basically see, it's a transnational center for just transitions in energy, climate, and sustainability. It's not a research project, but it's a capacity building project financed by the EAERE. And we are currently signing contracts with all partners, so to speak, and it will hopefully allow even more cooperation and work on these projects, allowing for interchange among various partners on various continents, but the main hub being in Colombia, as well as a side hub in South Africa. And as both of these countries are major coal exporters, this is the reason for our choice of these locations. And we have the honor of basically coordinating this work. And I have also included in the chat a link to the Twitter page. At the moment, we don't have a website yet because we don't have signed contracts. We don't have any financial resources yet, but keep following us and you will be updated on the status. But enough said from my end. Once again, thanks to all the organizers. Thanks for all of you taking the time. Thanks for those that stayed with us, even though we're taking a bit over time, and looking forward to even more cooperation on international agenda, working on these important topics digitally, but hopefully also meeting one another physically as soon as possible again. So take care, everyone. Stay safe, and until next time.